Good morning.
Hey, Adam, it's good to see you.
It's my favorite mug. It's a progression of the history of art across. I start from cave paintings, and you go, and there's the Renaissance. Man is the measure of all things, and then we go into postmodern and modern, and
Awesome.
yeah,
Very, very clever and rich. Cool. Love it.
the evolution and devolution of der Geist. So,
All on a mug.
things complexify and change, and it's important to trace their complexification and change to understand them.
I believe that for sure.
Including things like mindedness.
I think mindedness is important. Yes, indeed. And properly construing that in the planes of existence. And maybe I'm alone on that, but I believe that.
I don't know if I'll be successful through this endeavor I'm doing of UTalk pilling the AI community, but so I'm editing this journal collection of Royal Society on the topic of world models as it appears in AI, and I personally agree it has some bearing on some relations to consciousness and overlap of these ideas of world modeling and consciousness. But in the context here of like, there's this debate about like what's the world modeling capacities of these AI systems we're building, but as related to what we've been discussing, like the debates are not as fruitful, it seems, as they could be, because people don't understand one another. They're using words differently, and they're assuming that world modeling is just one thing, as opposed to there's maybe different types of world model that have complexified over the course of evolution. And then if you're thinking of like, same thing as like if you think you're thinking of like mind one versus mind two versus mind three, and people have different connotations in mind. Well, when if they don't know this when they're talking to each other, they'll just like it'll be very unproductive. And so it seems we need something like we need a unified tree of knowledge, not just for psychology, but we need it for AI too.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly so. Right now, as I think I might have mentioned on a previous thing, I'm interested in a unified worldview project, and central to that is the claim that we're missing a coherent for the natural world, which would then relate to the AI world, a coherent tree of knowledge that specifies the concepts and categories in a reasonable grammar. That's the Enlightenment gap is my diagnosis for the failure of that. I have there's a history of that in terms of understanding where science takes off, what it does to traditional dual worldviews, and then where it leaves us in a state of significant confusion, at least as far as I'm concerned.
Would you think of the different types of mindedness you identify as, would you call them natural kinds, potentially?
I think that they, they're, to me, so when you get into natural kinds versus, say, family resemblance of concepts, okay, the specificity there's a dimensionality to specificity and precision of concepts. I will say this. The kinds of mindedness structures that I propose afford the kind of specificity that we're lacking. And so in that kind of sense, I'm not super fond of natural kinds languaging, but I will say this, it's very clear what I mean by mind 1B versus mind 1A versus mind 2 versus mindedness. Those have crisp boundaries in relation. They have crisp boundaries in the world. So if you learn how to use the vocabulary, there will not be confusion. And the nice thing is that they are comprehensive, at least is my argument, when we look at the various schools of thought, from radical behaviorism to traditional cognitive psychology to phenomenology to 4E cognitive science to neuroscience and biology. I've got access to something that binds together the parts, like the old elephant or puzzle piece metaphor, and allows us to see the whole. And the lines are drawn with precision. So whether or not the kind of precision meets the criteria of a natural kind, that I think is probably more of a philosophical nitpicky question.
So there's a coherent clustering, and a coherent clustering, though, due to particular properties arising as major transitions in evolution and phase transitions, where basically you have qualitatively different regimes.
Exactly. I will say the planes of existence represent natural kinds. So put at that level, life organism mediated by the functional information processing, communication, networking that happens at life organism ecological structures versus the mind animal 3D behavioral behavior of the animal as a whole across a sensory motor loop versus the propositional culture person plane. I will consider those natural kinds.
What I like about your, one of the main things I like about your typology or ontology, it's like it makes room for both continuum thinking, as well as though appreciating when you're doing something qualitatively different potentially. Like so some of the qualities, there's a through line going right all the way back to, you were saying, like first kind of like creature consciousness, like there's like this kind of like Matryoshka doll building up, and there's some of these properties that are new ones being scaffolded on the prior regime, and also with the continuing to function being essential. You know, we continue to need to like be monitoring the. We need to continue to be good organisms. You know, it's like
I never stopped being a material object. I never stopped being a living organism. I never. Well, I guess you could. I would die. I'm a minded ape, and I am a justifying person, and they're all nested and they're continuous at one level. But the tree of knowledge gives us a topology, a vocabulary, an informational causation argument about also the discontinuity. So John Vervaeke and I in our extended naturalism argue that your model of emergence, extended emergence we call, is a continuous, discontinuous dialectic that gives rise to emergent properties and emanating constraints. So all emergence needs, at its basic ingredients, you need continuity and discontinuity. You need the emergence of properties that are then constrained by emanating systems. And it is those feedback loops that essentially give you the outline for framing this thing we call emergence in general. And so that's right. And then the tree of knowledge gives us an ontology and concepts like mind animal versus living organism that enable us to specify the interrelated domains and how we can say something like is above and within. Like that's a complicated, hey, the thing is above and the thing is within. Mind animal exists within the living organism dimension. And at the same time, the topology of tree of knowledge shows you how it also exists in some ways above the living organism dimension. And that's an easy thing to get confused about without the right diagram. So yeah, it helps with that.
It's in terms of like the language of like both like within or above, like even though there's like a kind of hierarchy or a progression that could be traced, it seems like some people might have some resistance to that idea in terms of maybe thinking it's a biased attempt at privileging or like, you know, us as being special, you know, relative to the rest of nature in terms of what we can do. But there's like a sense in which it's like, well, we are indeed quite special. It's in some ways like there's a sense in which, you know, you can trace certain forms of mindedness, you know, all the way back to the first, you know, unicellular organisms but they're not justifying creatures capable of engaging in cumulative culture. That is something new under the sun. Once you that is an emergent new set of constraints and affordances that you have.
Totally. I mean, it's a complexifying new functional information processing communication network that binds together at a higher level of organization. Now, it may be disastrous. I just ask all the other mammals. It's not whether it's good or not is a different question. I can make my arguments as to why, but the argument that we are behaviorally exceptional is not hard. You really have to, and it is not, we're self-centered, we're the arrogant ape, and therefore that's why we're special. No, we're not special because we're the arrogant ape. Look around, that's it, and watch all the different behaviors that we engage in. It's really pretty simple at that level, and you can do it descriptively without making much in the way of evaluative claims. You can describe it in terms of the evolution of behavioral complexification, just like animals behave very differently than the rest of the organismic the rest of the living organisms. That's behaviorally true. I'm a behavioral scientist.
And in these like AI debates, the so what types of world modeling systems are we dealing with, or what types of or more generally, what types of mindedness are we dealing with respect to modern AI, and as AI is now, as it soon might be, like, which of the properties of mindedness are we capable of recapitulating from like our approaches, and what would it take maybe to do that? Like because I guess I'm zooming out the most, but the like even like some of the framing of something like artificial general intelligence. I think it was maybe Connor Leahy has said it this way. Maybe others like actually specifically saying like we're looking towards what is it that distinguishes like a human-like mind from a non-human primate mind, and once we figure out that difference, like that being the thing ultimately, when we have that, we will have systems capable of doing the full range of things we can do, and then that would be this ultimate game changer of. But whether that's, I'm curious in artificial intelligence whether the extent to which it will necessarily, in terms of capacities, we're going to have to be having a progression, a UTalk-like progression being recapitulated. Otherwise, there's no way of, as we're trying to seek systems capable of doing increasingly sophisticated things and things with the full sophistication we can do, and capable of dealing with us and interacting with us in our full sophistication. It's like, can you do you have to the growth of the tree? Do you have to recapitulate that?
That's a good question. So first, we want to get our languaging. I mean, I'm big on languaging. So artificial intelligence systems have no mindedness. There's zero mindedness. There's no mindedness there at all. Period. They're not minded. So that's one of the things we get clear on.
They're not systems. They're
not organisms. They're not living. To be minded, in my definition, you have to be alive, and you have to have a nervous system, and it's mediated through the nervous system and the behavior of the animal as a whole. That's the instantiation of the kind of functional awareness and responsivity that we see in animal behavior, and that's what I use the term as label as minded. Now, you can mimic mindedness, just like you can mimic justificatory structures, okay, in the sense that you can create artificial computational systems that mimic input-output relations. And then we can wonder when the mimicry is such a simulacrum that it's valued as identical and then functionally identical on input-output structures. You would never want to call that mindedness from a UTalk vantage point. Because mindedness binds us to the instantiated structural functional history of a nervous system in the world. And it says that I'm not a pure functionalist. So people that take the functionalist philosophy of mind says that all mind is just the function. And therefore, if we replicate the function in a computational system, then that's what mind is, and they have exactly the same mind. I think that's a big error. I think you want to separate out functional capacity from structural instantiation historically. Now, that can become increasingly trivial for particular reasons, but right away, it's not trivial now, because when you ask me, hey, is artificial intelligence consciousness? Conscious? I'm like, well, do you mean mind too? Obviously, artificial intelligence has zero mind too. They are replicating through large language modeling our propositional automatic language acquisition device, or pieces of it, it seems, and creating a simulacrum of justification. It's a justification machine. That's at least what the large language models are. And so there's a tool that can simulate justificatory process. They crack that code on a predictive processing angle, or whatever, however we want to frame the artificial intelligence. That's not my area of expertise at a refined level. But it's just a computational structural functional input-output system at this level. So it's intelligent in the sense that it generates functional awareness and responsivity. It mimics our self-conscious justificatory intelligence. And then it will have its own particular set of instantiated structures that we can then wonder about, and we can then, and I make no limits on what it is that you could build potentially, but don't call it mindedness. Like, it's not embedded and instantiated anymore. We would think it's alive. If it's not alive, it ain't minded.
So could you get something like mindedness if you were bootstrapping an artificial intelligence, trying to use some of like the principles of artificial life, or bootstrapping it off of basically some sort of cybernetic control process? Right. So let's say like a virtual organism.
Yeah.
So it may not be like an actual living organism in like the world, but let's say you gave like a rich enough virtual embodiment.
Yeah, you can. Well, that's consciousness too. Okay, so that's you can. I have no idea. This is quite a great mystery. Like, what is could a silicon computational structure have the same kind of consciousness too? And what would that consciousness two property structure look like? So that's, to me, that's consciousness too. That's the property structure. Okay, that it's still our consciousness structures instantiated in what I call mind two, which is basically this inverted skin structure we call a brain that builds a particular kind of neurobiocognitive modeling of the world. Can you map that functionally and create properties? Then you would say your artificial system has consciousness too, which is the subjective perspectival experience of being in the world. That's the property. Whether you can build something like that, that's where, as far as I'm concerned, we're not even in the ballpark. But it's still not minded. In language of talk, it's still not minded. Whether you could build a cyborg, you can then say, well, okay, it's got part neurons, part this. And, I'm not saying there's nothing in between, but I want to use my natural language for what naturally occurred, and bind that to a particular set of knowledge that we have about the historical instantiation of events of complexification. So that's not, to me, there's no problem with just binding it there. And then we have the words available like consciousness. I would say that you're building then a consciousness two system, seeing if we can, a subjective and conscious experience of being. So does Data, Commander Data from Star, what's his consciousness two properties? Is he a zombie? If he's a zombie, then he has no consciousness, philosophical zombie in the David Chalmers sense of the word. Or can he have consciousness two properties? Is there something that's like to be Data? Then you can ask all of that. To me, you want to reserve the term consciousness two, in this case, the subjective experience of being in the world, in a way that is property identical to what it is like for us to be in the world. You just call that consciousness two. Still wouldn't be minded in the way in which I use the term.
So if you have someone commanded data, something like Commander Data, but some sort of artificial nervous system that's part of what it's doing, though, is it's modeling action perception cycles, and it's serving as a controller for, and in this case, like a body in the world, and trying to maintain it and preserve it with value signals relating to how good or bad you're doing, being part of this how you're adjusting the modeling system. So like, if you're having representation of the action perception cycles of a body, but it's not necessarily starting from a living organism, but from like a controller for a robot.
Mhm.
Could we be getting at mind 2 then, or do we have to?
It's still, I mean, my language is just, then you're building your artificial cognitive intelligence infrastructure. And then the question is, can we build that cognitive artificial intelligence infrastructure in a way that creates a recursive cybernetic structural functional modeling loop that gives it a subjective experience of being? Then it gives rise to your artificial consciousness. So artificial consciousness 2, specifically the properties of the experience of being in the world. So in Utah's language, I'm going to be very distinctive. Consciousness refers to the properties related to awareness. That's what consciousness does. It refers to properties of awareness and whether or not you have them. It doesn't say, the term consciousness doesn't say anything about instantiation. Okay. Life and mind say things about, commit you to particular kinds of structural instantiations. That's all. So it binds you to particular kinds of structural instantiations. So if you take them off, you just make sure you separate out the properties and the functional construction and functional organization from the system that's instantiating them. And what Utah is saying is that we haven't done that. Like that sometimes mind is a system and sometimes it's property. Most of the time consciousness is a property, but you're trying to figure out what the system. This is actually use the tree of knowledge in the map of mind. Clarify the term of what mindedness is as a nested structure that has property at some level and then creates the system. And that's the system that we're talking about in animals with brains, and particularly then humans. And that's how it gets instantiated. That's what the term ought to be, in my estimation. Then intelligence, cognition, consciousness. Cognition for me is an information processing system that allows for agency. Broadly, very broadly defined. That's sort of what cognition is. Intelligence is the adaptive problem-solving structures in relationship to it. Consciousness 1 is the functional awareness and responsivity, and that's why biocognitive intelligence and consciousness 1 are all intimately related. They all essentially require a particular input-output processing structure that's controlling things at a particular level. It's autopoietic at a particular level, and it represents a functional awareness and responsivity. And we can network all of that in what Levin identifies as a cognitive light cone. So it's got a cognitive light cone, meaning that it seems to be situated in the environment. It acts like a particular agent. If you create obstacles, it seems to move around it, and it creates a particular morphological, physiological, transcriptive structure that is beyond the normal causal properties of dead matter. So that's the concept. Consciousness 2 then is the subjective experience awareness of being. It's a wonderful question. Can we possibly build an artificial intelligence system that has subjective conscious experience of being? I don't know that anybody's in the ballpark of that. That's a great question. I would still say it doesn't have it's not minded, at least in the Utah term. It's just because it's not instantiated in that particular way. Because I want to bind the instantiated system to the functional properties, because the languaging is necessary at this juncture in our grammar.
Well, so properties like consciousness could be multiply realizable. For mindedness, you want to reserve it for this this genealogical progression going from where as you're getting these the way the cognitive light cones are becoming broader and broader is and nested within one another is those specifically. There's a genealogy going back to organismic self-making and preservation, and basically being in life itself, and the conditions of maintenance being at the roots of this tree.
Right. Exactly. So I want to map the tree all the way back to what I call the tree of root cause these days. That's all the way back to Big Bang and down in quantum theory. And then there's a generalized tree of emergence. And then there's the tree of knowledge that we can map from living organisms, our particular branch of this tree of emergence that happens in the universe. And then our particular branch goes from living organisms to minded animals to cultured persons. And then mindedness represents the property of the third plane of natural existence. on our tree. And the plane of existence means it's bound by a particular kind of functional information processing and communication network. And we don't want to just take mind as simply the function. That's a mistake. That's what you don't do that with life. Life, we actually do. Our vocabulary of life binds it automatically to the instantiation. That's why it's so much more natural to say artificial life. Oh, it's artificial life. Okay. Well, now you have your specifier. Now we're going to build an artificial life system. People don't then confuse that thing's really alive. It's just simulating life functionally. I just want to make sure you're doing the same thing with mindedness. You can simulate it. So do artificial mind.
Mm.
Okay. And actually, the word consciousness does the work once you realize that this is not consciousness. It operates with really in the world. And I believe that it can be really usefully operated as a property without necessarily a priori specifying its instantiation in a system. To me, mind should, and confusingly has not, been bound to the neurocognitive functional information processing network that then is identified as the third dimension of complexification, or the third plane of existence. This is where Utah comes in and says, everybody's confused. If you don't see the four planes of existence, natural planes of existence, you're confused. Pure and simple. And it basically says everyone's confused. I mean, and if you're confused, and we're collectively confused, you're going to have all sorts of problems in relationship to getting collectives together with the right vocabulary and the right correspondence of reference. But,
what are your reservations with the term natural kind?
well, I saw a big debate. I got into the sort of, at one point, Lisa Feldman Barrett came up and basically was like, hey, emotions are not natural kinds. And then I got into the sort of the history of what a natural kind is and what the level of specificity is. I was certainly familiar with, Roche's family concept idea. And basically the argument from my vantage point is that philosophers wanted a particular kind of category in natural kinds that could be really useful. And there are certainly some things that are very useful, like a hydrogen atom can be specified. And there's certain domains in which natural kinds are crisply delineated. But as I got into it, I thought there were a lot of intermediate categories, like emotion was a good sort of like, and so trying to place this question about what do we mean by emotion, I think Lisa Feldman Barrett was probably correct ultimately. I actually then found the need to have the category and then to apply the category ended up creating more heat than light in my own the kind of understanding. Maybe somebody that with more facility with those concepts in terms of the rich debate could help me internalize them with more refinement, and therefore I would not be like, but I sort of gave up. I was like, well, I don't know. This seems to get into the philosophical nitpicky weeds in a way that wasn't super helpful for at least what I was trying to do. That's not an uncommon experience for me, I'll say. You have to remember, I'm essentially coming at philosophy from a totally different orthogonal angle. Like I re-enter philosophy through this tree of knowledge. And so I'm actually, that's why I'm a total outsider of philosophy in some ways, even though I study a lot of philosophy. I'm shifting the ground really of philosophy in a particular way. And that has lots of consequences for how I experience the history of justification in philosophy.
Kind of along maybe similar lines, I sometimes wonder whether I should abandon the qualia word, because I know like within philosophy of mind, there's all these commitments once you start saying qualia. But that being said, I do want something, I'm trying to figure out like, how can a biophysical system in its operations and its being also be an experience generator? And so then I want to introduce a Q word, but then once I do that, it's like I have to duck because a bunch of philosophers are going to come at me saying, wait, you mean this? No, I do not mean that.
That's exactly right. So that's sort of what happened with the emotion. I was sort of committed. I was like, oh, I like that as a natural kind. Then I learned actually natural kind the way I technically, now it's got a diffuse. Now it's actually, then it's family resemblance concept. Then where am I in this debate? I like qualia myself too. I think they bind to particular types of things. One of the things that Utah tells you is qualia emerge in the context of mind 1A. So they're not biophysical things, or at least not only biophysical things, they're biophysical psychological things. So you have to make sure you understand that there's a whole other layer Just like biology adds something to physical, psychological, at least neurocognitive meaning of psychological, adds something to biological, and qualia emerge as neurocognitive, nested in biological, nested in physical things.
I'm curious with the I mentioned some of the debates that like Lisa Feldman Barrett's work has ignited, and so my understanding, we overestimate the universality of emotions as and assume that we can trace them back as evolutionary adaptations, when in fact there's a process of cultural construction that ends up becoming dominant and is highly context sensitive. And even though like there's like a broad agreement across cultures in terms of like the way we talk and we relate socially, we overestimate the extent of this because of the highly flexible and context sensitive nature of the constructive process. I guess the thing I wonder about is whether some like if it's baby in bathwater is being thrown out, or whether we can.
It's huge. It's complete baby in bathwater. Okay,
Yeah,
I mean this is an this is an area I studied fairly significantly, and it's another area of these languaging issues. And I really like Lisa Feldman Barrett. I think she's super smart. I also think that she plays a political game. She comes out with stuff and then leverages stuff in a way that gets a lot of attention. And then when you actually peel back what she's saying, she's not a philosopher, by the way, and she gets a truck ton of like on mind, super confused. And then when you really, so for example, she's like, oh, there's no such thing as emotion. There's not everything sort of, but there's a core affect system. Okay. There's a core affect system that evolutionary generates us on the circumplex model of affect: pleasure, pain, active, passive. And this is the centralized driver of what it is that's organizing our higher order thought. Okay. Well, really? That's what you mean? Okay. If you listen to some of her rhetoric, it's like, oh, emotion totally constructed initially at first, and everything depends on the context and the languaging. Well, that's because you're defining emotion in a particular sort of way. So you just go back to the history, really is the key. You have to understand that it used to be behaviorism, where basically behaviorism is questioning what's going on. It's enormously environmentally contingent. Even feelings like emotion are wondered about or not seen as useful. And the evolutionary history of the species, although actually people like Skinner took this very seriously, it was easy to take a shallow behavioral view as tabula rasa. Okay. Then you get Paul Ekman and the emotion evolutionary people. And the emotion evolutionary people say, oh my God, it isn't the case that we're infinitely flexible on all the emotions that we can have. It isn't the case that all of our stuff is responded to based on learning and conditioning. It's actually that we come prepared. And so then Ekman does all of his facial stuff and he goes cross-cultural and he says blind babies have the smiles and blind babies have facial experiences, and nested within us are a class of biobehavioral affect emotional response sets. And then you get the primary, there's disgust and there's sadness and there's fear. And you had early people like Joseph Ledoux looking at fear and saying, there's actually a pretty good fear loop here. An instantiated fear loop, which we can basically talk to, and this is where the amygdala explodes on the end. It's like, oh, there's a basic trail. And then when you really look at the other ones, and the fear is definitely the best one, but when you look for your anger circuit, and you look for your sadness circuit, and you look for your joy circuit, and you don't get the circuits. So the neuroscientists think in terms of circuits. You have a quasi-fear circuit, which is arguably, then becomes more and more debatable, that at first you look like you find a fear circuit. And then if you listen to Paul Ekman, the argument will be, we should find circuits for these 7 primary emotions. Okay. And his argument essentially says we're going to find the natural kinds of emotional circuitry. This is where Lisa Feldman Barrett is going to come in and say that's bullshit. And she's right about that, basically, in my estimation. However, this is why I didn't like the natural kinds. She then is able to come out and say, well, everyone tells you that you have a lizard brain and you have a mammal brain, and that nature gives you preps these natural kinds of circuitries. So you have a disgust circuitry and you have an anger circuitry, and that's built in and that's hardwired, and that's the way your emotion system is lined up. And that's wrong. And then you get into the debate about what do they really say, how really wrong it is. And then she and Jaak Panksepp, I don't know if you know Jaak Panksepp, but Mr. Affective Neuroscience. So Jaak is delineating the core motivational emotional structures that we see in mammals and shows that there's a lust system, a play system, and a rage system, and a fear system, and a panic system, which is different than the fear system. And he's delineating these motivational architectures, and they're pretty clear, and there are particular. So he's like, wait a minute. The whole point of affective neuroscience is actually there are motivational emotional architectural pathways that delineate certain kinds of functional problem response sets that we come prepared for. So then they all blew up. In fact, they're shouting matches in conferences where they went at each other in a way that was less than restrained for a conference. And so they blew up about this whole, and then natural kinds was right at the heart of it. There's such things as natural kinds of emotion. And then you have to go to the philosophical definition and then tease apart whether or not Ekman really overdefined them, which I think he did, whether or not we're talking about motivational emotional patterns or real emotional isolated structures. That's all. What's the layering? Okay. And in fact, she comes in and says, blows up the whole idea that you have a non-conscious reptilian mind. Okay. This is Lisa Feldman Barrett's 7.5 truths about the brain. And the most important truth is the triune brain sucks. That's what the most important truth is. There is no such thing. People were taught that you had a reptilian, non-conscious, automatic, instinctual brain, that you had a feeling mammal brain, and that you had a talking human brain. And those are the three great brains, and that's complete crap. Okay, that's what she said. And then you're actually, Lisa, this is where I want to get into. Lisa, what about mindedness, Lisa? That's what I want to ask her. I don't know. Hey, Lisa, isn't there a non-conscious functional awareness and responsivity that you trailed the evolution of slugs in your book, and you said it's a movement system, and you said it's generating, and then isn't it the case that emotion across the circumplex model of affect does get organized, and as the brain gets organized, and there is a place clearly that we have a subjective experience of being, don't we? And that at least corresponds, maybe octopus have it, but certainly the cortex of the mammal seems pretty important to you in relationship to the experience of being. And isn't it the case that we talk and have mind three? So it may not be three brains that are completely separated like Lego blocks, but actually when we turn it into mindedness, right? You actually have a functional awareness. Responsivity goes essentially from worms to reptiles. Then you have a feeling system, goes up into mammals, probably into octopuses. That's a great question. Subjective consciousness clearly happens with the cortex. And then you get a narrating structure on top of that, mind 1, 2, 3, right? Total mind 1, 2, 3. That corresponds a lot to these rough categories in the brain. So she comes in, this is another reason I don't like her rhetoric, blows up this thing and says there's just absolute absurdity. Paul MacLean grossly exaggerated all of this stuff. It means no sense whatsoever. And I actually have a blog. I said, yeah, but the triune mind makes damn good sense. If we go for triune mind, there's layer 1, there's layer 2, and there's layer 3. And that certainly corresponds to what people are pointing at. So let's have at least a conversation where we're a little bit more complexifying, integrated, coherent building, rather than rhetorically leveraging and angling and going to popular press and saying, you guys think this because somebody told you wrong and I've got the right answer. And, fine. You can sell a lot of books that way, but it really adds often more heat than light from that vantage point.
Perhaps professionally strategic, but in terms of us trying to understand the natures of emotion, it may not be so productive. Because some of the heat dissipate. So I don't know what the best way of handling it is. So like so to the extent that there's overlap in the affective language being used between emotions as constructed and these basic emotional systems that people like Panksepp identify, like could you say like, I don't know, fear 1 and fear 2 or something like this, where it's like, or I sometimes heard the concept of like emotions, but basically it's like, but some sort of like marker, it's like yes, the constructive process, once that comes online, can create things that are qualitatively different than our emotions as we experience them through this constructive process. They cannot be reduced to these these core circuits, but still saying there are affective, but denying that there are affective systems for which we could appropriately use emotional language.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. I mean, that's what UTalk says is, yes, first off, we are animals. Okay. And so let's talk about us as animals. Well, we perceive stuff. And then into mammals, certainly, we perceive stuff. We have approach avoidance categories that then energize motion based on action, active, passive, and pleasure, pain. Okay. And then that gives rise to 4 different categories of mood and orientation. One is calm, content. Pleasure, passive, is calm, content. Okay. Active pleasure is desire. Okay. And reward dependence. Active avoidance is fear, and passive avoidance is depression. These are the categories. These are the categories, mood, affective categories of the circumplex model of affect, which she uses as her core affective system. Okay. And then UTalk comes along and says we're also social primates, and it puts the influence matrix there and says what the social animal is doing is not just doing other self-world modeling and tracking active, passive, pleasure, pain relative to how you're dancing in the world. It says you're actually self-other world modeling. And then the influence matrix gives us things like, oh, here's the self-other dimensions of power, love, and freedom, and places things like anger and guilt and pride and shame and love and hate into a network. Now, are these exact precise things, or are these attractor states that emerge out of perception, motivation, emotional dynamics of an animal, mammal in the world, or a mammal primate in the social world? And her system says, oh, yeah, it's exactly what that is. And so does mine. But my system, depending on how you turn it, says, well, actually, these are channels then that give rise to, clearly there is an anger, self over other channel, and there is a guilt, other over self channel that gets activated reliably. Okay. It's also the case, she is right, that once we get a narrator, okay, I was feeling somewhere between humbled and humiliated. That's not a circuit. Okay. But that is an egoic narrator with a rich vocabulary it's creating. And as you create categories of conceptual brain states, those create patterns within the network of the brain. And so the brain's very plastic in the way it can reorganize itself in terms of a perception, motivation, affect loop. And so her whole point that as we create stories, then we get greatly differentiated elements. So yes, there's no circuits that align to Ekman's categories. They're not laid down. There's channels that are cybernetic that offer a PME loop at the level of the animal and at the level of the social world. Those channels create categories that we can recognize as stereotypical emotions. Okay. And that's why many, many cultures have these very similar terms. When you get more refined and you get adults, you get feedback loops between the ego on the experiential self on my 1A system. And this is massively plastic rather than laid down circuit. So a constructivist approach to emotion is reasonable, but don't overshoot it.
Use the term PME.
Oh, sorry. So UTalk organizes its basic input evaluative output structure on the PME control theory formulation. P stands for perception. Okay. So senses come in, and then there's a bottom up, top down tracking system where the task of the perceptual system is to determine what is in the world, basically by schematic mapping, predictive mapping on, and then that's immediately referenced in relationship to the interior system, the interoceptive system, which is tracking the body's motivational states, like what is homeostatic, what's allostatic dynamics in relation. Are you hungry? Are you content? Etc. Are you horny? So these are motivational structures. And then the perception is referenced in relationship to the motivation. The difference between the discrepancy between what the motivation's oriented and what you see, then E is energized motion, which is the root of emotion. Okay. These are then channeled perceptual response sets that then cluster, okay, to prime particular kinds of bindings between the subjective perspective and conscious contents. All right. So all of a sudden, if you feel fear, okay, so let's say you're threatened in a particular way. All right. Now all of a sudden you're in an active avoidance state motivationally. You're now tracking your sensitivity threshold for threat lowers, and the structure of the subjective attending structure is then oriented toward that particular kind of thing, and you are primed towards escape or freeze functions. That's what the perceptual motivational structure of fear is to flee or freeze. That's what you're now primed to do. And then it's the perceptual, and then that's at the down animal level. Then this thing becomes more and more nuanced in feedback as we get higher and higher across time arcs, extended time arcs, meaning that the system is more immediate and reactive, lower in the pole, and then more blended and differentiated as we go for increasing sophistication. So it's a cybernetic model. So in other words, just like basic cybernetics, you have an input detector reference to a set point that then creates an output function, and that's how we get control systems. The argument is that in nature, your perception system is essentially the input detector. Your motivation system is setting you for set points, and your emotion system operates your proprioceptive embodiment to act in particular kinds of ways. It energizes motion.
Motivar, to move.
To move, exactly. Energize. I think the actually history of that word is to energize movement in a particular way. And then emotions, as we get higher order, then they're basically priming you to see and act on the world a particular way. But they're, for humans in particular, then they become clusters of semantic affective networks, basically.
How do you use the term feeling and emotion synonymously or differently? Like I'll sometimes think of feelings and emotions like almost like a perception action cycle, where it's like the emotion is the change in the organismic mode to be in a adaptive configuration, considering a certain class of value relations to the world, but the feeling is the perception of this change.
Yeah, actually, so
does that seem reasonable?
Totally, that's what I use. So I have three terms, okay, that I like to use in my so yes, emotions are the perceptual response set functional network that energize motion in a particular kind of way. That's what they are as a cluster. There's two coin sides to them. One is affect. Affect is the physiological behavioral propensity. So actually, as a clinician, I watch my clients' affect. Okay. Feeling then is the interior mind two, if we're talking about humans, the interior mind two angling structure. So I prefer the term, it feels like this to me, and you watch my affect accordingly. The entire cluster is emotion. Okay, so feeling is a mind two term. I feel this way, which is my interior perspective on the world. Affectively, so I am angry. Affectively, you look angry, and the cluster of my anger is emotion.
Mm. So I'm thinking of somewhat, I don't know if it's just a semantic debate. Sometimes have with Mark Solms. So like he'll say that the idea of an unconscious feeling is like an oxymoron. Like feelings must necessarily there must necessarily be a subjective experience associated with them, what it is like. I don't quite. I'm not completely unsympathetic to that. I mean, we could use language differently. Just like we have to be precise in how we're using it. But it seems like there's like a big question for me where it's like I could see a system perceiving and having a representation of its change in emotive state, but and there being even like yeah, there's something like representation, but not necessarily conscious representation. There's just
So,
like information. I'd be totally fine with that. And for me, I would use the language like the perception, not necessarily even subjectively experienced, but the representation of the change in emotion. But
so again, consciousness, we got to get a bunch of nuance. So it's conscious of, all right, versus consciousness. Okay, so in the psychodynamic meaning, so, and I know Psalms it's got psychodynamic history. We got to be very clear. In the psychodynamic meaning, and this is where I would differentiate with him. I'm sure if you would have, can I have unconscious feelings? And the answer is depends how you define. I can't have non-conscious feelings. That's what I would say. What I mean by that is you can have this pure mind one priming structures that are not actually accessible. They're subconscious, subconscious. Okay. And what do I mean by that? It means like they haven't entered and been organized by mind two. Now, as a human, okay, and indeed we have, do the big toe, become conscious of your big toe, right? I have on my feet, there we go. While I've been sitting here, there have been feelings that are potentially accessible that I am not conscious of. Right? So they reside in my subconscious. But I have feelings of the bottom of my foot, but I haven't had feelings of the bottom of my foot till I just mentioned, at least in the last half an hour. Okay? So we want to be very clear that somebody...
There's information coming in, but it was not in the workspace. It was
not in the workspace. It wasn't part of the conscious attention, and therefore I was not conscious of it. Okay? So if you then add the psychodynamic point about the Freudian filter, okay, the Freudian filter is, well, my term for Freud's great insight that things are threatening to the constitution of what you want to be conscious of, and therefore you block them. Okay. So I use the example all the time of somebody coming out of over time to see this. And this happened to a friend of mine back in the day. He was gay, but didn't know he was gay and came out to himself like years after we would say that he had homoerotic feelings. Okay. And you could now argue with this structure that said that he had homoerotic feelings that he was not conscious of. Okay. In retrospect, he becomes conscious of them. And then we use the example of the bottom of my foot to make that clear, whereby just like the demands of this conversation have been to not pay attention to the bottom of my foot. The demands in the 1980s were basically, if you had homoerotic feelings in the 1980s and your dad was homophobic, guess what would happen to those feelings? You'd repress them. Okay. And I use the example of an old photograph, an old Polaroid. You'd start to take a picture and a Polaroid would start to come online. Okay. What would happen as the feeling emerged that you'd see a naked man and you get aroused by that? Okay, that begins to happen. So in other words, this becomes into your subjective mind two space, begins to make a connection between the perception, the motivation, and the motion loop that then draws you towards it at one level. Now, are you conscious of it? The argument from a Freudian perspective, and I think there's a lot of good evidence for it, is that as that begins to emerge, you have detectors, filtering structures that say you don't want to make certain kinds of channeling loops aware of the system. Just like when you're in conversation with somebody brings up an off-topic, and I hate Trump. Wait a minute, this guy loves Trump. I want to change the topic. How about the Eagles? Okay, now you can see us do that all the time, right? Here would be have an example of somebody that would have subconscious homoerotic feelings that they are not conscious of. Okay, so then my point is that you could use the term feelings that are outside of consciousness. They're subconscious in the sense that, however, it would be the case that I would only use the term feelings, that if he were to introspect and be in a safe environment where he could see them, this is why he came out of the closet to himself initially, is that he finally turned the attention, his conscious attention, to this in a place where the filtering was not so strong that he could actually see it and hold it. And these were subconscious mind two feelings, meaning they were organized enough so that they could be interpreted. Okay. As opposed to other things like you can never introspect and actually see his thalamus sending the signal. I mean, you can't get to the brain this way. And there's a lot of non-conscious neurocognitive architecture that you can never gain access to. Okay. I feed my turtle worms, and the worms have a proprioceptive response, avoidance response. As soon as my turtle bites into those worms, those things start shaking. Okay. Now, do those worms have feelings? I don't know. Do they have any kind of mind to feeling states? To me, that's a great question. It certainly makes sense that they're zombies, potentially, given the structure of worms. They're potentially zombies. What does that mean? It means they're having a proprioceptive, non-conscious avoidance response. Okay. There's an architecture there, but they're complete zombies. They don't actually feel what it's like to be bitten into. I don't know if worms feel anything. But you have a proprioceptive mind 1A, mind 1B avoidance response set. Okay, that's essentially, that's reflective and is a narrow PME structure that's completely non-conscious. It is prior to a modeling structure that would give a subjective point of view on it. That's the feeling side of emotion to me. And it's anyway.
How would so what language should I use for? Because I'm thinking in the case of repression, I can think of like different levels at which the oppression and the repression is pulled off, where potentially the disattending is successful enough, or the filtering where just in general, there never is a moment where the feeling of attraction, even though there's some reactive dispositions that could then like shape behavior in different ways, in ways that might be subtle and might cause you to they're still in the background, they still show up, but I guess that so one level of like of unconsciousness is that there was never any period where there was anything that was like to feel the attraction. I could think of like a kind of like an intermediate case where you might have like splicing in frames of a movie, or there might be like a couple
there's lots of examples. I don't have any problem.
The moment there was something that it felt like,
sure,
but because you don't let it unpack in the way you're describing, and then like re-represent this and narrate on top of yourself, or unfold in some sort of like causal sequence, you don't remember it. But in the moment, you're just not holding on to them. Subjectively experienced affective responses. Would you use the term conscious in that sense, even if you cannot report on it or access it? So it's like there's in the moment.
Right. So these are events that are taking place on the edge of mind too. I mean, this is, that's basically what you're describing is events that take place on the edge of mind too. Okay. And so it's the mind 1A, mind 2 interface system, which ranges anywhere from obviously full on. The subject brings the thing that pulls the signature and attends to it in the global neuronal workspace through an ignition switch. Right. If we go global neuronal workspace, there's a lot of subliminal structure, right, that clearly is taking place. There's a lot prior to the 300ths of a third of a second or a quarter of a second that there's a lot of flashing going on. Right. So there's clearly but whether or not that's conscious, then the argument simply is there's an interface. There's an episodic interface zone in the field. Right. And then it's like, well, what level to me? Yeah. So to me,
like entering into a workspace due to like you achieved ignition, but then you did not succeed in getting taken up by an episodic.
Right. So then there'll be all sorts of kind of layers in relationship to this is the interface between mind 1A on the bottom and mind 2. And then if we're talking humans, then you have another layer. Okay. Of mind 3, self-recursive consciousness of being conscious of, which, by the way, is what Freud was talking about. Freud was not talking about the second layer.
Could you use a term, was it autonoetic for that also?
Sure.
Would that be?
Absolutely. Well, you get into Tulving stuff and the whole kind of like, what is the Salving memory structure? But yeah.
So, and yours also, you were distinguishing between conscious and consciousness. So like I was like earlier mentioning, for instance, like the idea of like creature consciousness, which would go back to any sort of like valenced responding by an organism.
functional awareness and responsivity. So when we detect galvanic skin responses on subliminal triggers, that's consciousness one, by the way. That's the system is prepping itself for something that has importance without any getting into mind two, where the body, and in this case through a nervous system, then it's mind one priming.
So you can have mind one within a nervous system, but also mind one in terms of, let's say, like going back, or a single cell, or think of like a bacterium, I don't know, extending a pilus to like exchange chromosomes or chromatids or whatever, those little circular DNA elements, like another bacteria. Like, is that like related to a creature consciousness?
That's creature consciousness, but not mindedness at all.
But you could call that something like a kind of emotion, creature consciousness related, like a lust, but
yeah,
if you will, or
Right.
or like let's
Sure.
say you're entering into like a sporulated mode in the face of threats. Is that like a fear? But or could you use like affective language, and you could even say creature consciousness, but we're just not in mind two territory.
Right, or mind one territory. I mean, you're not.
So in that case, not even in mind one territory.
That's not. No, remember, mind one. So that you got to use the tree of knowledge, and mind one comes along with the nervous system. Okay, but before there's a nervous system, there's a lot of biocognitive intelligence. That's what that's creature consciousness
not
goes
mind
in.
one yet.
No, not at mind one, but creature consciousness of which. And what are we talking about? It's demonstrating functional awareness and responsivity, meaning that there's a goal. It's trying to get its replicating material into that thing, and do you want to say, well, it's fucking that thing, right? And it's like, well, let's talk about language and all this other stuff. And what do we want to use? I want to say that's biocognitive, morpho, physio, transcriptive intelligence. That's what it's doing. Okay. And then it's got goal states. I'm okay saying it's got goal states. I'm okay in calling it a cognitive light cone. Emotion feels a little, I want to be careful about energized motion, because I really want to bind that to the 3D behavioral investment system. Okay. But I don't have a great language, I'll certainly confess, because it's not my area of expertise. Yeah. How do you talk about approach and avoidance in a biocognitive consciousness one sense? Like, what is the architecture that's instantiated in this? How is that thing moving? Okay. What is the approach avoidance cybernetic structure of a cell? I'm pretty ignorant on those lines. I as a psychologist in my mindedness system, I would be hesitant to use
But
it.
if there was like a gradedness to some sort of perceptual, motivational, like for instance, like if there was like a degree of vigor of approach of avoidance based on some kind of
which there almost certainly will be. There's going to be a biocognitive cybernetic control system of some kind embedded in there, for sure. But I don't want to call it minded. I want to call it biocognitive. That's all. Just to use the term. What is it? It's going to be some sort of information processing, cybernetic, regulatory, autopoietic, functional awareness and response system, which is a kind of cognitive agency that has what I would call participatory knowledge in some ways, in the sense that it's going to carve out its identity relative to the world in some particular way, have some boundary in relation, and then will release particular kinds of procedural knowledge, okay, to use that term loosely, but this is all because it demonstrates awareness of its environment in some sort of functional way, and then it achieves goals in some particular kind of way, and that we can even create obstacles around. So to me, that's the functional information processing biocognitive architecture.
So the use language of emotion, we want this PME set up. And so in theory, you don't necessarily need a nervous system as we understand it to do that. But like as you start to go to
let me put it this way. I want to go the other way, because when I want to do this, so PME, I want to put those in mindedness terms, although I would be open, just like, whether we use cognition, I'm totally fine with using cognition. Whether there's biocognitive perception that's not inside of a nervous system, that's an interesting question for me. Okay. I have my own particular structure. But remember what it's built off of. That's what the PME is built off of, a cybernetic formulation. The cybernetic formulation is unbelievably simple. You have an input, you have a referent, and you got an output. a fucking thermostat is a cybernetic system. It's the simplest kind of control system there is. Okay. And clearly biological systems are these cybernetic systems in that regard. Okay. And they obviously have sensory and movement structures. And I'd really need to get into the weeds, like, and say whether or not there's actually a thing inside the cell that corresponds reasonably to the concept of perception. Okay. And motivation. And I don't know enough about, like, the brain is a pretty obvious informational control cybernetic structure. Its entire system is this input system based on sensory input, and it's regulating the output of the motor system, and it's centralized control structure. And then there are networks in of it that is obviously devoted to perception in a particular way. I just don't know enough about cells. Their behavior is functional awareness and responsivity. They clearly input, have a hierarchical cybernetic control regulatory output structure, and then dynamically approach and avoid certain kinds of things. That is obvious at the level of behavior. Whether somebody wants to come along and say, I think that there's something so akin to perception, and then I'd say, well, there's a centralized top-down, bottom-up input mechanism that binds and then references to a representation of the motivational goal state of that creature, and then coordinates output in a centralized way. If that's in the side of the system, I'd be much more, okay, it's a biocognitive perceptual system. I still don't want to call it minded, but then that makes sense to me. But I don't have enough knowledge to say one way or the other.
I don't either. I've been studying it. There's some often abandoned manuscript, integrated life world modeling theory I was working on, trying to basically wondering, like, if we want an account of a cell as a minimal agent in a minimal world modeling system, like, and described as a cybernetic control architecture, like, how far could we go with that in terms of, like, a mapping onto different cellular processes to a very basic world modeling and agency. And so then, like, there's this one paper, really fascinating, as one special issue that Mike organized. It was called this idea called selfos, and it was like a generalization of the default mode network across all living organisms, like including the cell, as a kind of like metastable near or near critical organismic scale set of attractors that were helping to be used to basically control organismically sensible bifurcations. Okay. And so I was like,
yep.
And
yeah, so that's the more similar the architecture, certainly. Yeah. And like I said, there should be a lot of similarity. The PME goes all the way to a thermostat, and a cell's going to be somewhere in between there. It's going to have similar functional component parts regulating an overall cybernetic architecture that's doing the identity of the self in relationship to the world. It needs to do that. That's a minimum. How consolidated that is. I mean, if you really have something inside of a cell that's akin to a default mode network, which then I'd be like, holy good, okay, you're powering that thing up. And I certainly confess my own ignorance along those lines. So
I'll share the paper. I think it's wild and very well written. I think you'll like it.
Sweet, please do.
Yeah, ultimately, what looping around to, so I want this, both for understanding natural intelligences and beings like us, but also for artificial intelligence, a way of talking where there could be some agreement around this, where you can express both continuum and discontinuum, or they're both like, you can describe like a common core across systems of different degrees of sophistication, but also track when you're dealing with qualitatively different kinds of sophistication with respect to things like world modeling and agency. Like, so basically I want to have something like, I don't know if this would be like, is it you talk like for talking about artificial intelligence. We just situate artificial intelligence within you talk. I guess like, but I'm wondering like, yeah, like a best. I don't want to say natural kinds, but like
well, right. I mean, all I can so. I mean, within the tree of knowledge just says, well, the big natural kinds emerge because you get different functional, nested, hierarchically arranged, fundamentally different functional awareness and information processing communication networks. So the different planes of existence arise because there are these qualitatively different kinds of languaging systems or information processing communication network systems. And the basic that's the functional architecture. It's the force functional awareness and responsivity through information processing. I mean, there's some input, right? There's some output. There's some cybernetically organized, computationally modeled process. Okay, that gets us into the what's going to be true of artificial intelligence systems that are going to carry over this. Those are the functional property, structural, organizational level, but not necessarily then instantiated system. Okay. And then whether or not they're different kinds of informational, like for example, whether or not the neural network modeling structure versus classic logic gate some formal architecture, like are those kinds of things, are those novel different kinds of information processing systems, and could you nest them in particular kinds of ways? That might be interesting.
like nesting like a neurosymbolic system.
Yep. Yeah. So one of the because anyway, the bottom line is that nature has given us, according to this framework, nature gives us as long as we know how to look at them, nature gives us these three planes of existence that are organized in this particular sort of way, and the nested recursivity between them, at least, is what's necessary to account for the kind of human intelligence that we offer. And there would be good reason to believe that there would be potential power in nesting different kinds of information processing systems that we could build. But
and the other question.
What's that? Yeah,
so
go ahead.
So you called it a simulacra of a justification system, and I guess the thing I was wondering is like without you having the kind of nesting that we have, is it necessarily always like, can you get like in many aspects of justification functioning, like hallucination problems, like will it always be lacking in coherence unless it has this nestedness in terms of like the way you get there?
Right. Well, that's I mean, yeah, I mean,
unless it's like connected to some sort of like integrated representation of the system itself as
it feels like it needs a different kind of constraint structure, basically. And I don't know. I mean, when somebody like Penrose is like, oh, ultimately we're non-computational, to me, well, there's a particular kind of constraint hierarchy that's non-computational that we bind that relates to what he's talking about when we just, see and comprehend. That kind of architecture seems missing in relationship to the LLM and what kind of intelligence that is, and whether or not that intelligence could be achieved differently than the stack that we have. I have no idea. That's way outside my wheelhouse.
But when we talk about like a justificatory system, or we're talking about like, so it'll inherit and because we are justifying beings, and it structures the way we talk, and it's conditioned, it's trained up on learning how to sensibly remix, given having read, or not really read, but having been trained on like the sum total of all our communications, and given our communications have been from us as justifying beings, it can do a lot of similar functioning.
Mhm.
But and so with respect to so what are like the minimal criteria you would need though to like call something a mind three system? Like if we can.
Right. Well, obviously, I mean, Mind 3 is embedded and nested. So there's the justifying formal architecture. That's what they're modeling. You and me, our Mind 3s are nested and embedded in Mind 2s.
Yeah.
You know, so
They need
that's
that.
what. So you got the. They have. I have a language acquisition device that functionally probably has a lot of predictive processing of the way it places grammar, and that's why I can automatically talk. So let's talk. We can talk about it in terms of my mom. So my
We have
mom.
we have our own inner GPTs that are just capable of doing next token prediction, because like the words just come to my mind. I don't need to like
Right.
there's like a motor skill of like my grammar that just
Right.
can run and give me the words that are likely to come next, structured in a where the whole string has like the right hierarchical structure and it's parsable and sensible. But that doesn't necessarily need to involve yeah, that can operate in a zombie mode. Basically,
Yes,
just
totally. That's basically a Mind 1A architecture, and it happens through procedural knowledge, and it's in parallel, at least functionally, then in parallel to what we see in LLMs and things like that. And it's interesting to watch. So, like my mom's, I think I mentioned a couple of times, my mom's got moderate now dementia. She still talks, okay, but it is fascinating to watch the fraying of the binding that networks her perceptual reasoning architecture and the functional justificatory architecture, as opposed to just basically spelling out, reading out vacuous sentences. So now the system just spells out, read out, oh, they went to this and I think they're coming over today, and then this is going to happen, and when are you leaving, and what's happening? These are just basically empty vessels, okay, with no content. Like she can't, whatever her Mind 3 binding structure that connects to the Mind 2 content and then recursively analyzes the correspondence principle. Like, is this making any sense? That system is okay. So then it's like a frayed blanket, and all that's running then is pulling little indexing functions. They're coming over, they did this, we did this, as like, and with complete, if we just took a transcript of it, there's like there'd be nothing that's meaningful here. Like there's nothing that corresponds to reality here. There's just a spit out function of the basic architecture of pronouns, nouns, the grammar, with emptiness, because as whatever's happening to her is the binding capacity of Mind 3 to Mind 2 in a perceptual architecture that also then has an epistemologically justified architecture that got lost, in late stage Alzheimer's. And but left, the Mind 1A procedural language acquisition device is still clacking along.
So what would be the minimal criteria you would need to say that a system is engaging in justification? Or is it justificatorious?
A justificatory entity is one that can self-reflect and take responsibility for one's actions, and then humans then decide that you're competently to be held accountable. That's the legal. It's basically, what's the legal definition of a competent person in terms of its full form? So a justifying agent is an individual that can say, hey, I know what I am doing, I take responsibility for what I am doing, and I can understand the consequences, and I can choose my actions accordingly. That's sort of a full suite of what a person is, I would say, and ultimately what makes us persons. What my mom shows is, and what other things can show us, is fragments of that, and certainly LLMs mimic that, obviously, in terms of but LLMs are not accountable for their behavior and the cultural person claim existence.
In terms of that kind of accountability, so sometimes I guess maybe both from some developmentalist accounts, or just like I guess the Catholic tradition, like the Age of Reason. It's like so around like 7 years old.
Totally.
It seems like, but you mentioned the like Tomasello earlier. I'm thinking about like the games he's showing like children playing, where the children can start to say even before 7, like, hey, you're cheating, that's not fair. And then they're like kind of calling each other to account to some degree,
Totally.
but not yet having this, it's not the winner call to account. It's not clear they wouldn't be
They're
able
not. They're not agents at the level of persons, okay? And what they are initially, Diane McAdams calls them social actors, okay? From 2 to 6, you are downloading the justifying rules of the system, and you are applying those rules to frame your behavior, test the rules, to track individuals, but to formally lift them off and legitimize oneself as an agent is something a 4-year-old really can't do, unless they're very precocious, and certainly 2-year-olds can't do it. But they can start to say this is wrong and this is right. And this you cheated, and they can definitely apply the rules of social actors. In other words, they understand rules and scripts and rules of games, and you play the particular game within the context, and that just defines what is for them. In other words, the script defines what's true, and then the reinforcement history and the present pain types of things will then pull particular kinds of justificatory lines. And one of the favorite examples of this that I use more on the justifying side is when my daughter's 4, my son, they were playing, and then all of a sudden they got a little bit heated. I was watching in the other room, and my son pushed my daughter, and my daughter pushed him down. And then I came in, I said, what happened? He's like, he fell. Okay. And then I said, how did he fall? He pushed me first. That's how he fell. Okay. So anyway, what's proper? So essentially, I didn't do anything. So she's just drawing on, she doesn't have the sense. Okay. And then another example of her when she was like 4, I had cookies on the table. We don't eat cookies until you go upstairs talking to my wife. Come on down. Cookies are gone. Did you eat the cookies? No. Well, where are they? I don't know. Well, how'd you get chocolate on your lips? Okay. So I'm socializing her to see the dynamics of justification, but until they're like 5 or 6, then all of a sudden it sort of clicks, and it's like, wait a minute, I do things. And this is what Dan McAdams calls the agent stage. It's a recursive capacity to recognize that I do things and I take responsibility for things, and I have some degree of freedom in making choices about what it is that I do, as opposed to simply handing scripts in situational context and play the role of the actor. So that 6 is essentially when you shift from into the agent stage, and then all cultures everywhere start to then say that at 6 they start to become little people, which means they actually have some capacity to be held accountable for their their actions as persons, as being choosing what's justified and having the agency to decide what they're going to do for whatever reason, and holding that aspect of their structure accountable. That's why people talk about, free will versus determined, like Robert Sapolsky. I hate that shit. When it's like, there is no such thing. It's like, well, what is every goddamn culture doing at the age of with 6-year-olds? The hell is every culture doing with 6-year-olds? Nothing. There's nothing that we're doing, Robert. We're just making it all up. No, there's actually a self-conscious recursive system. They think about what's justified, think about how they be held accountable, and start making choices and get socialized accountable. That's what it is. That's what it means to be a damn competent person. Right? And every culture then has a period of development up to 13, up to 18, up to 25, where the frontal lobe finally is developed, where you're actually a full-fledged adult. So there's this developmental period where you actually become a competent person for every culture. If you look for it.
I have to get off soon. I want to dig into free will with you later. I guess, before though, we have to go, I guess, there's a few more thoughts on like the case of like, so like you might prompt an LLM, and then it comes back to you and it gives you just like this missing the mark, incoherent response sometimes.
Sure.
And then like, but it might even though say it though in a way that's like highly confident, as like
it does that all the time. Yeah.
And then you come back to it, and at first it might respond with like a what are you talking about? Nothing's wrong here, of course. But then like sometimes but then if you reprompt it other way, sometimes you can get it to give it like a mea culpa, where it's like, okay,
yeah, mine always apologizes usually when I say it's bullshit. At least that for me, my chat GPT, I say that's a bullshit. I don't think I've ever had it say, no, it isn't bullshit.
You've never had it double down on you.
I've never had it double down on me. So that's interesting. Yeah, anyway, mine always says, oh, I'm sorry. You're right. I should have done this differently. After, like, it gave me a quote I never would have said. Like, help me understand it. Well, Henriques says, it's like, that's not me, you idiot. Oh, I'm really sorry. I should be more careful next time. That's what it always says. So
there's like saying like, I'm sorry, but then they're saying like, let's say it said like, I'm sorry, I gave you this I gave you this confabulation in this case because like I wasn't sure what to do in this case, and then this seemed like the most likely thing given my like some like if it's there's one who's saying like I'm sorry, and I say I'm sorry because, and here's where I messed up and why. That here's where I messed up and why, that would be engaging and would you say justification then, or the?
Well, I mean, these things simulate justification. You know, for me, what I take this word justification and then I say, actually, we want to think about the structural, functional organization of human propositional language as justification. There are explicit instances of justification, but actually, you and I have been, this entire conversation has been structurally mediated by and functionally organized by the process of justification. So every utterance nests itself in that for me in the cultural person plane of existence. Okay. Like at some level, what is the framing for cultured persons? And the framing is justification. And actually all utterances actually bind themselves in relationship to this. This is the relevance frame. That's everything is framed by justification according to this structure. So at an implicit level, that's what's happening. And then we talk about all the different layerings of this particular meaning. So you're saying when you say, hey, how's it going? Well, first off, you open up a behavioral investment channel. And then as soon as you frame that a particular way, you're now in a justificatory propositional question answer dynamic. So all question answer dynamics are justification. No, what have we been doing? Track their question answer dynamics. That's the better way to frame it in a more common sense way. But actually, what are question answer dynamics? Questions open up spaces, answers try to fill them. In what is the metric? The context of justification, the frame of realizing legitimizing articulations for the space. But that's a whole nother network. So yes, it is mimicking justification. That's how I think LLMs, I'd love to really find the history of LLMs, but to me, they crack the code at some level, modeling human propositions by basically framing propositional queries and sentences through justification, and then they utilize their passive superpower and predictive processing to fill in the sentences accordingly. But it's all drawing, and so it loses the frame. That's when it confabulates bullshit. It can't find the frame in the basic architecture, or it just pulls off the wrong frame, and then it looks like it's talking gibberish. But anyway.
And then I'm digging this later, but the take home I'm trying to say for this intro I'm writing is I think the contrary to people who say like the only way you could do next token prediction is to somehow infer a causal world model that corresponds to that which you're talking about. That no, if you just train something on massive enough data, that just this likely like just doing next token prediction, if you give it enough data, the likely things that should come next, you can do it without having any kind of simulation environment running in parallel. That you could do it, and without being able to feed back on that. But
yeah, my skill is delineating the tree of knowledge and the natural intelligences of the world. That's what, and recognizing the planes of existence, and especially the joint points between life to mind and mind to culture, and to think about wisdom in relationship to the fifth joint point that we find ourselves in. I'm happy to offer thoughts about the bridge to artificial intelligence But unfortunately, I am a psychologist that deals with people's traumas rather than a coder.
Well, thanks for letting me drag you in there today.
No, I just want to be clear. If anybody's listening, I don't claim, I'll speculate, but it's way out of my training and expertise. I've never coded a thing in my life, so I'm a little slow in those areas.
Maybe next time we'll turn to free will. But
right. Well, and the first thing I'll tell you is that's a shitty term, but then we can go from there.
I'm looking forward to it, and thanks for talking today.
All right, man. Always enjoy it.